What would you do if one tiny discovery in your own bathroom unraveled 9 years of love, trust, and family? This is the story of how I uncovered the ultimate betrayal, and how it changed my life forever. The shimmer caught my eye as soon as I stepped into the bathroom. It wasn't the sunlight itself, it was how it reflected off something on the floor, a glint that immediately pulled my attention. Barefoot, I hesitated, not wanting to risk stepping on broken glass or anything sharp. Caroline hadn't mentioned dropping anything in here, but you never know. At first glance, I didn't see anything. The carpet and the object seemed to almost blend together, the difference only apparent when the light shifted just right. Eventually, I spotted it, a small, circular scrap of foil lying innocuously on the floor. Picking it up, I immediately recognized it as the backing from a pill strip. You know, the little foil discs that pop out when you push a pill through. Most of the time, they stay attached to the strip. But sometimes, like this time, they break loose. I held it up to examine it. One side was blank, and the other bore faint markings, indicators of the days of the week. It was Wednesday, and the marking suggested this piece had come from Tuesday's pill. That meant the pills were being taken daily. But why? That was the question gnawing at me as I stood there. I wasn't on any medications. I'm 35, healthy as can be, and Caroline was too, or so I thought. We'd both had physicals recently, even shared our reports with one another. Clean bills of health for both of us. So why would there be a pill strip backing here, in our bathroom? The obvious answer came unbidden. Birth control. But that didn't make sense either. Caroline had stopped taking the pill years ago, after I had a vasectomy following the birth of our second child. There was no need for her to be on it, and she didn't have any medical conditions that would require hormonal medication, like cramps or irregular periods. Caroline was one of those women who had relatively easy cycles. For a brief moment, my thoughts spiraled into a darker place. Could it be an illness? Something she hadn't told me about? My stomach turned at the possibility. But I shook it off, reminding myself of her spotless physical exam. She was healthy. I was healthy. There had to be another explanation. Yet the foil disc in my hand begged a question I couldn't ignore: if the pills weren't for me, and they weren't for her health, then why were they here? And if this small scrap of foil was here, then surely the pills themselves had to be nearby. I quietly closed and locked the bathroom door, my heart already pounding as if it knew something I didn't. Caroline was still asleep in bed, her soft breathing faintly audible through the wall. Determined not to jump to conclusions, I began searching, scanning the bathroom for any sign of where the pills might be. It took longer than I expected, but eventually, I found them, hidden at the bottom of a tampon box, inside a secondary container of aspirin. When I pulled out the strip of pills, a sinking familiarity hit me. They were unmistakably the same kind Caroline used to take before I had the vasectomy. Back then, she'd taken them between pregnancies, and even before we started trying for kids. But now? Why was she back on them? We had no need for birth control, or at least, I didn't. One answer loomed above all others, a grim and terrible realization: she was sleeping with someone else. Someone who could get her pregnant. Caroline had cheated on me. As the weight of the discovery settled in, memories of our life together began flashing through my mind. Caroline and I had been together for 9 years, a time that felt, until now, like a picture-perfect marriage. We met when I was fresh out of university, focused on building a career in engineering, and she was working as an assistant. It wasn't love at first sight, but there was enough of a spark for her to agree to dinner. That was the beginning. Caroline was striking. Tall, only slightly shorter than my 5 feet 10 inches, with the kind of athletic frame that hinted at her former life as an athlete. She had a lean figure, modest curves, and an irresistible charm. Her best feature, at least in my eyes, was her incredible backside, which I adored from the start. After a year of dating, we got married. I was 26, and the future felt limitless. Our family grew quickly. First came James, now 5, and then Sonia, just 2. They were everything I'd ever wanted, a boy and a girl, our perfect set. After Sonia, I opted for a vasectomy. 2 kids were enough, and we had agreed to focus on giving them the best life possible. Caroline loved her work and didn't want to give it up, even after the kids were born. She took short maternity leaves and returned to her job with renewed focus. We hired an au pair to care for the children during the day, an expense that nearly offset Caroline's salary, but she didn't mind. Her happiness at work seemed to outweigh the financial burden. Meanwhile, I had joined forces with a couple of friends to build an engineering firm. We weren't wealthy, but the business was thriving, and life felt stable. I thought we were a team, working hard to build a beautiful life together. Now, holding those pills, that foundation felt cracked. Was it all an illusion? My mind raced with questions I wasn't ready to confront. I carefully cleaned up the bathroom, returned the pills to their hiding place, and sat down to decide what to do next. My world was shifting, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to face where it might lead. I knew I couldn't act impulsively, not yet. Confronting Caroline without a clear plan or solid proof would only make things worse. My mind was racing, trying to piece together the next steps. I needed to know more: who was she seeing, how long had this been going on, and, most painfully, whether it involved someone from work. The thought of it being her boss, or worse, a connection from before we even met, made my stomach churn. Then, the most dreadful question of all crossed my mind: were James and Sonia even mine? That possibility gnawed at me, but I couldn't let my emotions cloud my judgment. If I was going to face this, I needed facts, hard, undeniable evidence. Only then could I decide what to do. That day at work, I found myself distracted, running through the options in my head. By the time I left, I had resolved to take action. I stopped at an electronics store and picked up a few tools to aid my investigation: voice recorders, hidden cameras, a phone cloning kit, and extra memory cards. If Caroline was hiding something, I was determined to uncover it. I returned home earlier than usual. The au pair was busy feeding the kids dinner before getting them ready for bed. I used the opportunity to discreetly install the cameras. One went in the bathroom, another in the living room, and the third in the bedroom, positioned to capture a clear view of the bed. These cameras would tell me what Caroline wasn't. As I heard the kids splashing in the bathtub, I stepped in to help. I took Sonia from the au pair and got her ready for bed while the au pair stayed with James. It was a brief reprieve from the weight of what I was doing, a reminder of what was at stake. By Monday morning, I had already begun my surveillance. I told Caroline I'd be working from home for the day, giving me the chance to monitor everything without arousing suspicion. Once she left for the office, I retrieved the flash drives from the cameras and began reviewing the footage. The bathroom camera confirmed my suspicions: she was taking the pills. That alone was troubling, but what I saw on the bedroom footage left me stunned. On Saturday night, while I had been preparing dinner, Caroline had taken a shower. In the bedroom afterward, she sat on the edge of the bed, using her phone. The way she was texting, quick and deliberate, made it clear it wasn't casual. When I later checked her phone, I found nothing incriminating. She must have deleted the messages. But her actions on the footage, the secrecy, the urgency, told me there was more to uncover. The picture wasn't complete yet, but the pieces were starting to form a grim outline. I sat beside Sonia's bed, gently stroking her hair, as my thoughts churned. The warmth of her little head under my hand grounded me in the present, even as the weight of everything I'd uncovered pressed down on my chest. A few moments later, Caroline appeared in the doorway. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, as she asked, "Is something wrong?" I shook my head, whispering, "No, I just like to sit with one of them sometimes. It reminds me how lucky I am to have such wonderful kids." She smiled faintly, her tone light. "You're such a soft old man," she teased. Come on, let's go before you wake her up. I followed her out of the room, but my mind was miles away. That night passed in uneasy quiet, but the next day, when I accessed the cloned phone, my world shattered. It wasn't just the texts that broke me, it was the clear picture they painted. There was someone else, a man. The messages were flirty, intimate, and unmistakably romantic. Plans made, secret moments shared. My stomach churned as I read them, each word a blade slicing deeper into what I thought was an unshakable bond. Later that day at work, my colleague Michelle must have noticed something was off. She entered my office with a concerned expression, closing and locking the door behind her. Without a word, she pulled out a small pack of tissues, handed them to me, and sat quietly, waiting. I wiped my eyes blindly, struggling to find words. All she said was, "Tell me." I hesitated but eventually shared the outline of what I'd discovered. Michelle listened without interruption, her face reflecting the gravity of the situation. When I finished, she nodded and offered practical advice. You need to decide what's next. Do nothing, confront her, or make plans to move forward. Whatever it is, you need to be prepared. Her clarity helped, but the choices loomed large. One option was to stay silent, to pretend nothing was wrong and keep the facade of a happy family life intact. The second was to confront Caroline, knowing full well it could lead to an irreversible fracture. And then there was the nuclear option, divorce, splitting everything we'd built and potentially walking away from the life I had worked so hard to create. I told Michelle I needed time to think, and she nodded, giving me space. That evening, as Caroline and I sat down for dinner, everything felt painfully normal. I watched her closely, wondering how she could sit there, smile at me, and act like nothing was amiss. My mind churned over what I'd seen and the decision I had to make. For now, I resolved to wait. I needed more clarity before taking any steps, but one thing was certain, life as I knew it had already changed. Michelle's suggestion was clear, start covert surveillance to gather more evidence. We need to know the who, when, and where, she insisted. Her calm, practical demeanor steadied me as she added, can I keep the cloned phone for now? It's not helping you, and I'll handle anything important. I nodded, silently handing it over. The weight of my suspicions was already too much to bear, and parting with the phone felt like relinquishing a piece of my turmoil. Michelle guided me out of Lorraine's office and took me to a small, family-run hotel. She booked a room for me, her tone firm yet kind. Go take a shower and order something to eat, she instructed. I'll come back later with some essentials. I complied, too drained to argue. The shower offered a fleeting sense of normalcy, but it couldn't wash away the heaviness. When Michelle returned, she carried a bag with fresh clothes and toiletries. Her presence was grounding, but her focus remained on what needed to be done. We spent hours talking, making plans, not just for the personal chaos I faced but for the future of the company. I had floated the idea of selling my shares to my partners and stepping away from everything. Michelle dismissed it outright. That's not an option, she said firmly. You've built too much to let it crumble. If you sell, they'll have majority control, and you can't trust them to keep things intact. They'll run it into the ground. Her words reignited a spark of determination in me, a reminder of the resilience I had once prided myself on. There was a time, I said hesitantly, when the patent office lost an application for an inversion filament, and we managed to win the deal anyway. And another time when the bank tried to foreclose on us early, but we fought through it. Michelle leaned forward, her expression unwavering. And at what point during those struggles did you sit down, put your head in your hands, and give up? That was different, I muttered. Why? She pressed. What's different now? Her words struck a chord. Back then, I had fought because I believed in the future, in what I was building. Now, even though my personal life felt like it was unraveling, I realized I still had something to fight for, my family, my career, my dignity. By the end of the evening, Michelle and I had mapped out a plan to secure the company's future while maintaining control. It was a small step forward, but it gave me a sense of purpose. The next morning, Michelle knocked on my door. "Breakfast," she said simply, gesturing for me to follow. We walked to a nearby diner and slid into a booth, the smell of bacon and maple syrup filling the air. The contrast between the mundane act of eating pancakes and the storm raging in my heart was surreal. Part of me wondered why I wasn't breaking down, why I wasn't consumed by despair. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was holding it all at bay, waiting for the dust to settle. When it finally did, I knew the weight of everything I had discovered would come crashing down on me. For now, though, I focused on the next step. I threw myself into work, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy while my thoughts churned with suspicion and dread. Brian, one of my closest confidants, could tell something was off. He offered support without prying, which I appreciated. When Michelle called with an update, I answered quickly, trying to read her tone for any hints. "The results aren't ready yet," she said, glancing at the phone. "According to the tracking data, they'll arrive within the next 12 hours. I exhaled deeply, not even realizing I had been holding my breath. "Let me know the moment they're in," I said. She nodded and left, her determination steadying me in a way I desperately needed. Taking decisive action had become my coping mechanism. I freed up equity in our house, cashed out my 401k, and closed every savings account we held, including the children's college funds. It felt ruthless, but I was preparing for war. The financial separation was surgical, leaving nothing Caroline could easily access. Michelle reassured me, "At worst, you'll lose half of whatever you leave in joint accounts, but beyond that, we can make it work. In fact, if we adjust your salary to appear lower than hers, she may even end up paying you child support." The thought gave me pause. What do I live on if my entire salary is tied to loan payments? I'll still need somewhere to live, food to eat, and, I hesitated, the weight of the thought pressing on me. And there are the children. At least, I think they're mine. Michelle didn't flinch. "Have you decided what you'll do if they aren't?" Her question hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Could I walk away from James and Sonia, children I had loved and raised as my own? I wasn't ready to face that yet. When the results finally arrived, I read them alone, needing to absorb the truth before sharing it with anyone else. Neither child was biologically mine. Worse, they shared the same father, and it wasn't me. I felt the betrayal strike like a physical blow. Caroline hadn't just cheated on me, she had passed off another man's children as mine for years, convincing me to have a vasectomy in the process, robbing me of the chance to ever have biological children of my own. Grief turned to rage, raw and overwhelming. "Gary." Michelle's sharp voice cut through my spiraling emotions. "This isn't the time or place. Calm down. We'll get through this. I promise." Her words brought me back, grounding me momentarily. But the pain was far from over. Later, the final blow came when I caught Caroline's lover, her boss, Bill Wright, walking into my house. He had his own key, a detail that twisted the knife further. As he entered, James looked up, his small face lighting up. "Papa Bill," he shouted, running to hug the man. I couldn't hold it together any longer. My hands clenched into fists, and tears streamed down my face as the reality of everything hit me. Lorraine stood beside me, silent and solemn, as I broke down completely. My world had crumbled, and I could barely comprehend how I would pick up the pieces. I broke down completely, and for the first time, Michelle hugged me. Not a perfunctory gesture, but a genuine attempt to console me. She helped me back to the hotel, her presence steady and unwavering. Once there, I trudged to my room, barely holding it together. Just as I was about to collapse onto the bed, a knock at the door startled me. Opening it, I found Michelle standing in the corridor. "Let's go," she said firmly. "What? Why?" I asked, confusion cutting through my exhaustion. You can't stay here, she replied, already gathering my things. You'll just brood or attack the minibar. I don't trust you to be alone right now, and I want you where I can look after you. I wanted to argue but didn't have the energy. She led me out of the room, took my hand, and guided me to her car. Her no-nonsense demeanor was oddly comforting, giving me the direction I desperately needed. Back at the office later, Spencer, our lawyer, reviewed the partnership agreement with me. I'd been considering a way out of the business to avoid having it entangled in my personal mess. However, Spencer and my partner, Brian, had a different perspective. I'll give up most of my shares, Brian said after a thoughtful pause. But I want to keep 5% and stay on as a consulting engineer. You can have the rest. I nodded, my voice hoarse. I'll ask Spencer to prepare the documents. Gary, Brian said softly, after a moment's silence. I'm really sorry about all this. I know it doesn't feel like it now, but it'll get easier. I promise. Thanks, I murmured, appreciating the sentiment but struggling to believe it. Michelle, who had been running things for me, laid out the next steps. We've got 2 more stops before you head back to the office and pretend you've been off fighting fires in Portland. Do you think you can manage at home until Monday? I think I'll have to, I replied, the weight of that thought settling on my chest. No need to guess, she said with a reassuring smile. Tell me what you need to hold it together until then. I don't know, I admitted. Good news would be nice. Michelle smiled again, her tone confident. Then let's work on that. To my surprise, one of our stops was at a doctor's office. As the doctor explained a potential surgical option for reversing my vasectomy, I found myself torn. The procedure was possible, though not covered by insurance, and the doctor's frankness about the costs was sobering. I barely processed his words as he handed us informational brochures. Thank you, doctor, Michelle said, standing and gathering the materials. We'll be in touch. As we left, she turned to me, her voice gentle but firm. You don't have to decide anything right now, but this is an option. Just remember that. Her unwavering support kept me grounded, even as my world continued to crumble. I let Michelle guide me out of the clinic and to her car, my thoughts still clouded by everything we'd just heard. Is this good enough news for now? She asked, giving me a small, hopeful smile. I managed a weak nod. It wasn't the kind of news that erased the pain, but knowing there was still a possibility for my future helped, even if it was just a small light in the distance. As we got in line to leave the parking lot, Michelle muttered under her breath, I would take every last penny from this scoundrel. Stephanie's words echoed in my mind from earlier. Do you have evidence? She had asked. I did. And the weight of it was crushing. Proof that none of my children are mine. Proof that they share the same father. Video of him and Caroline in my house, where my son calls him, my voice caught, and I couldn't finish the sentence. The lump in my throat threatened to choke me, and I felt myself spiraling again. Oh, Gary, Michelle said softly, her tone filled with compassion. I'm so sorry. I suspected for years that he and Caroline might be involved, but Bill was always so careful. I followed him once, checked his phone, even his email, but I never found anything. Her words barely registered as I wrestled with the flood of emotions. I felt betrayed on every level, not just by Caroline, but by the years of lies that had built my life. Later that evening, Michelle returned to her professional self, as if flipping a switch. She looked in briefly before leaving the office and said, I'm heading home now. Good night, I replied, feeling oddly deflated. It was as though the small bond I'd begun to feel with her was just in my imagination. Thanks for everything. She nodded and disappeared, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I worked late that night, catching up on tasks I'd neglected while my personal life crumbled. Around 8 p.m., a message from Caroline appeared on my phone. Caroline, what time will you be home? Me, probably another hour or two. Need to finish some things. I stared at the screen, wondering. Did she know I was unraveling her lies? Did she realize I knew the children weren't mine? I couldn't shake the horrifying mental image of her taking the children to say goodnight to Papa Bill, as they so often did with me. My mind spiraled into darker imaginings, Caroline and Bill together, reveling in their betrayal, while the children cried in the next room. I shook my head angrily, trying to dispel the thought. I couldn't afford to lose control now. She had made her choices, and on Monday, I would make mine. I would confront her, and I'd take great satisfaction in watching her face the truth she had tried so hard to bury. Michelle's words rang clear and sharp. You need to take control of the narrative, Gary. If you don't tell your story, Caroline will, and believe me, hers will paint you as the villain. You'll go from being the ignorant cuckold to an abusive husband or worse, someone who mistreats his kids. People will believe it because they love a scandal. And when we nuke her, she'll come at you with everything she's got. I hesitated, the weight of her warning sinking in. So what do I do? I asked. You speak first, Michelle replied. You put your version out there, and people will be less likely to believe her counter-accusations. Some will still side with her, of course, but the majority will see through her lies. She wasted no time, preparing a media package for me, clear, concise, and full of evidence to support my claims. It was brutally honest but necessary. Everything was set to go live at the right moment, ensuring I'd have the upper hand. That weekend, I tried to maintain an air of normalcy. Caroline remained oblivious to what was about to unfold. On Saturday morning, I was woken by Sophie climbing into our bed, interrupting what would have been a rare moment of intimacy between Caroline and me. I smiled bitterly to myself, even the small disruptions felt like poetic justice now. I spent the rest of the day checking off tasks Caroline had been nagging me about for months. When she commented on my sudden burst of productivity, I simply said, it was high time. Inside, I was counting down the hours until the storm hit. On Sunday night, I joined a conference call with Lorraine and Michelle. Gary, Lorraine began, her tone measured but firm, this is your last chance to stop. I'm not saying you should, but if you've had second thoughts over the weekend, now's the time to speak up. No, I said without hesitation. I'm ready. Then I'll see you on the other side, Lorraine replied. Everything was set. I kept a close watch on my email inbox the next morning, waiting for the confirmation of service. At exactly 10 a.m., the first email arrived. 2 more followed in quick succession, each one signaling the start of a new chapter in this nightmare. Later that day, Caroline confronted me, her expression a mix of shock and anger. Gary, what is this about? She demanded, holding the papers she'd just been served. I met her gaze, my voice steady. No, Caroline, I said firmly. I don't care what you have to say. If you have anything you think I need to know, talk to my lawyer. Her card is in the package you received. Her voice trembled as she asked, what about the children? What children? I shot back. My voice was cold, unflinching. I don't have children. And thanks to you, I never will. I looked at Caroline, the weight of everything she'd done pressing on me like a physical force. I could ask why you did this to me, I said, my voice steady but cold. But I'm not interested in hearing another lie. I don't want your excuses, justifications, or reasons. I want this to end. This is my home too, she said, her voice shaky but defiant. According to the documents, no, I countered sharply. It's registered in my name alone. So, until the courts rule otherwise, get the hell out. My raised voice startled her, and she jumped slightly. Just then, James entered the room, his small voice breaking the tension. Mommy, he said, Sonia fell. Caroline's stunned expression shifted. Tears streamed down her face as she stood and walked out to attend to Sonia. I retreated into my office, closing the door firmly behind me. I stayed there, refusing to engage further, as she packed her things. A few minutes later, she returned, Sonia in her arms. Her eyes were pleading, but I gave her nothing. Without a word, she left, the sound of the front door closing marking her departure. The house felt eerily silent in her absence. Later, I discovered that Michelle had moved me into her spare room. My clothes were hanging neatly in the closet, and my papers were organized in her office cabinets. It was a strange realization, but also oddly comforting. A week had passed since Caroline had filed her countersuit. My routine became a blur of work and evenings at Michelle's house. I'd return, eat dinner, and collapse into bed. In the mornings, she brought me coffee and breakfast, her quiet gestures of care providing a small sense of stability in the chaos. The final confrontation came during a meeting with Caroline's lawyers. Caroline was in the room, but she didn't look at me. I had Lorraine and Michelle by my side, their presence a reminder that I wasn't facing this alone. "This accounting in the divorce petition is simply ridiculous," Caroline's lawyer began, his tone combative. "Your client is the main shareholder and CEO of a company valued at approximately $20 million, not to mention the assets tied up in the house, savings, and 401k. I clenched my fists under the table, letting Lorraine handle the response. She calmly outlined our counterarguments, dismantling their claims piece by piece. Michelle, seated beside me, occasionally leaned in to clarify points about the company's structure and financials. Caroline remained silent, her gaze fixed on the floor. It was a painful reminder of how far things had fallen, but I stayed focused. This wasn't just about protecting my assets, it was about reclaiming my life and moving forward. Lorraine held up her hand, stopping Caroline's lawyer mid-sentence. "Let me stop you right there," she said, her tone cutting through the room like a blade. She shuffled the marriage contract on the table, glancing at it briefly before turning her eyes to Caroline. For the first time, Caroline looked directly at me. "Gary," she said softly, almost pleading. 9 years, I interrupted, my voice cold and unwavering. 9 years you lied to me. Day after day. There's nothing you can say now that I want to hear." Caroline's face tightened, and after a moment, she turned to her lawyer and gave a small nod. Without a word, she signed the papers. I didn't stay to watch her leave the house. I only learned later through a letter from her lawyers that the restraining order had been lifted and the house was officially mine again. I could return whenever I wanted. The day I moved back into my home, I found an envelope waiting for me on my desk. Its presence was unsettling, but I knew what it contained. I opened it slowly, my heart pounding. Inside were the final divorce papers, signed and sealed. "That's it," I said aloud, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. "I'm done. I'm finally free." "Finally," Michelle said, her voice warm with relief. But then she did something I didn't expect. She leaned in and kissed me, not a fleeting kiss on the cheek or lips, but a deep, full-bodied kiss that left me gasping when she pulled away. Startled, I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what had just happened. My body betrayed me, reacting instinctively, and Michelle noticed. She giggled, her gaze flicking downward. "Well," she said playfully, "I guess you're not as exhausted as I thought." Her unexpected boldness caught me off guard, but I couldn't deny the connection we'd formed during this tumultuous period. Still, I was cautious. This was uncharted territory, and I wasn't sure what it meant for either of us. For now, I decided to focus on what mattered most, rebuilding my life from the ruins Caroline had left behind.